I don't know hardly what to say. I'm basically speechless. Uh, I'll say, wow, I really appreciate very much the comments that your friends expressed here. And Leanna, you are doing a terrific job. You and many other folks these days are going forward to spread this message. And so it leads me to say, send my thanks to those of you who are sort of taking up the task and doing so many wonderful different projects going in all kinds of directions because we really need this information, especially at the community level. And I can't thank you enough. So thank you going forward, obviously, for the kind of things you do, Leanna, and others. But also at the same time, I've had a long career that goes back now more than 66 years, actually, when I was in graduate school at Cornell University. And so I want to just say thank you at this time to some other folks who really made it possible for me to even be in this scientific arena. And I would first mention my dad, who only had a couple years education. He was a farmer, and he was just absolutely certain that I needed an education that he never really got. And so I drove 102 miles a day to high school from west of Washington D.C. just to start that. But between his advice to me to always tell the truth, nothing but the truth, and the whole truth, to many mentors I had in college who, in unsolicited moments, did just that and a few other things to make it possible for me to have the education I had. So I've got so many people to thank. And of course, along the way, I've had many students, graduate students, postdoctoral students, fellow professors, colleagues who, as well, made it possible for me to do the kind of things that we did. And if I were just to list a few things that kind of stick out, let me mention just a couple. And again, by way of my appreciation for having had the opportunity to actually benefit from these activities. First off, I would have to mention the National Institutes of Health, the leading research funding agency in the country, one of the leading funding agencies in the world, who actually was fairly generous funded for me for upwards of 40 years of worth of research. And of course, that's taxpayer money. I never took any funding from the private sector. All the funding I got over the years was from the taxpayer, you folks. And so I feel a great deal of responsibility, having been in this business for that long, to come back and say, collectively to everyone, thank you so much. Um, as far as the few things that I did along the way that I now recall as being particularly significant, I think maybe one of the first was a surprise, actually, as many of you may know. It started out with my observation in the Philippines when I was coordinating a project for feeding malnourished children at that time, who were supposed to be getting more protein. That was their problem, so it was said. And of course, I learned happenstance, if you will, that the few folks who got the most protein were the ones most likely to get the local cancer, which is liver cancer in this case. And so I took that idea back home again, got the funding from NIH, did the research over the years, thanks to lots of students and colleagues along the way. And I think the most startling thing, obviously, that I saw in the beginning, it really turned my career totally in a direction I never anticipated. And that was this idea of coming back to the laboratory and testing whether or not it was really true that feeding more animal protein would create more cancer. Indeed, it did. It did. And over many years with many students, we demonstrated that in many different ways. We learned how it worked. And the mechanism by which it works was not just one, it was a whole bunch. It was almost an infinite number of mechanisms working together to create a response that just absolutely led to this concept that Leanne referred to as whole. The book Whole was basically that. And I just find that idea so fascinating because to me, it was an image of nature. I felt like I had worked inside of cells, if you will, different parts of the body, and got to know the biochemistry to some extent. One can never know all of it, but it was an enormously complex system. All seemed to work together in harmony. I can't find the words hardly to describe how impressive it is that when we eat food and when we digest it and separate out the nutrients, that's just Mother Nature working, separating all the nutrients from that wonderful food in the whole food form, if you will. How that's when it's separated out, she takes what she wants to send it here and there, and combines things, and every instant, every nanosecond, this operation is working its magic. And it turns out that when you look at this enormous complexity, rather than taking out one thing at a time and make a career out of it, if you will, or a pill or something of that sort, what I saw was something far more spectacular. It was nature at work, choosing all the parts that we provide in the form of food, if we eat the right food, and then, of course, just watching the magic work. By magic, I'm talking about, preventing a variety of diseases, a full spectrum of diseases, I might add, especially the so-called chronic degenerative diseases like heart disease, diabetes, chronic kidney disease, cancer, and so forth. That the whole idea of the nutrients in food, or the food itself will eat the right kind of food. If from that food, it sort of works its magic to create the kind of response we get. And that concept of everything working together in this magical way is really what led me to realize, in fact, that that's the kind of thing. It's a basic biological phenomenon. It works throughout our bodies. It works across different species. It works at different ages. It both prevents future problems as well as restore health if you have a problem. I mean, all of these kind of things all of a sudden just came together as sort of like a whole. And that was the concept. That really has grasped my attention. It is basically the future of nutrition, which is the title of the most recent book that I did actually with my grandson, Nelson Diesla. And so, in any case, we went from the laboratory learning some basic details, mechanistic, biochemical kinds of things, and then to had the opportunity of working with some colleagues at Oxford University in England, together with many colleagues in China, and to do a survey across the whole country. This was the first research project between the United States and China, quite a challenge at the time. This was started way back in 1983. And so we did the project in China. Basically, I was interested to see if, in fact, what we were learning in the laboratory, so spectacular, to see whether or not that was equivalent to what we might see in a human population, especially in a place like rural China, where various kinds of diseases were recorded, the mortality rates for these different diseases. And there was a big range of mortality rates for different diseases. And so we had a perfect setting in a human capsule, if you will, together with what we learned in the laboratory, to put the cap around this idea that of all the things we can do in terms of solving problems in the world, and I'm talking now too, not only about saving on healthcare expenses, being healthy, making a healthy society, I'm also talking about the role of food in the environmental problems that we're now beginning to experience and see. We can solve those problems, believe it or not, or at least turn it around simply by choosing the right food. So this idea of eating the right kind of food, and right kind of food, already mentioned several times, plants. I learned along the way from that early observation in the laboratory that eating animals made no sense. There's no scientific basis whatsoever for us to eat animals for any reason, particularly for its protein content. We get all the protein we need from plants, and we're better off for it. So there's I end up with this long experience I've had from the laboratory to the lecture hall to the boardroom, whatever. The one thing I've learned is that the system is extraordinarily complex, and we get caught up too many times in the complexities, and we try to make stories out of it. It causes lots of confusion, when in reality, if we just stand back, look at all that complexity and then sort out what we think might be the most relevant things to say. And I've got a couple. Two very simple ideas. Without, as I say, getting caught in the weeds. And these two ideas, I would say we could export to the rest of the world, regardless of their level of education. Mainly, eat plants. That's number one. Eat plants. Number two, as much as possible, eat those plants in a whole food form. We can't just jump in there and pull out this nutrient, that nutrient, another one, this so-called vitamin, just put it in a pill and expect to get the same result. Doesn't quite work that way. So just two ideas: eat plants, make them whole food form, and then turn around to the wonderful guests you've had on here, Lana, who've shown us how to cook things too. That is sort of almost the main story of the day, and from my perspective, because people around the world, it's the same message for everyone. All we need to do is simply learn how to eat the food, and of course, we can acquire the taste. If we haven't been there, we can discover, in fact, the kind of taste that we have. I also should say along the way that as we did that work, I want to also acknowledge my first encounter. I was working in the laboratory, but encounter with some colleagues who are working with real patients as well. Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn, Dr. Dean Ornish, Dr. John McDougall, Dr. Alan Goldhammer, a number of others. It was, for me, it was the story of taking the basic laboratory evidence itself, which is irrefutable, if I can use that word. I'm sure that no one can come along and ever refute that. Taking that basic information from the laboratory in theory, combining it with the kind of results we now see in humans, whether we're looking at human populations or whether we're looking at them in the clinic. Either way, we've got in our hands. We have everything we really need to know to actually help to bring the world together and solve problems, and in the process save the planet. So I'm very excited about what, Leanna, you are doing here, because it's quite amazing. And especially in these difficult times, you were able to pull together the operation you now have. And so, again, I don't have time enough to thank all the many people that I've been involved with, but it's turned out to be a great experience. Thank you.